Thank you for attending this annual Sally Loyd Casanova lecture. I am honored to have been asked by our Dean of the School of Educational Studies, from whom you will hear more in a few moments, to say a word particularly about Sally Loyd Casanova. You have a very nice description of her and her studentship and her career in the handout for this evening's program. Let me say that it is particularly important that several people in this audience who knew Sally Loyd Casanova are here this evening, including my colleague, Professor Philip Dreyer, including one of the predecessors to this evening's Casanova lecturer, and that's Jackie Powers Dowd, who is President Emeritus of the wonderful Mount St. Mary's College, Ethel Rogers, who among the veterans here in the room knew Sally during her studentship here. But I just want to attest to the fact that Sally was a wonderful human being and an extraordinary PhD student. And after she passed away, very untimely, the faculty decided that we would initiate a series of lectures, and we chose to attach Sally's name to this annual lectureship. It augments, it supplements the longer-standing, what is now known as the Howard Bowen lectureship, but the Sally Loyd Casanova lectureship identifies for each year one of our distinguished alums to present the lecture. And I am very proud, as are my colleagues, that we have produced such an extraordinary group of alums, quite a few of whom have become college presidents and have other leadership roles as faculty and administrators in the higher education enterprise. So in just one moment, I'm going to turn this rostrum over to Dean Scott Thomas to introduce our extraordinary lecturer for the evening. I also want to acknowledge our wonderful president. Debbie, thank you so much for taking the time for being here.
I wouldn't want to miss it.
So let me say that we're in for an extraordinary treat this evening, and Scott, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Jack, and welcome everybody to our 18th annual Sally Loyd Casanova Distinguished Alumni Lecture. Tonight we have the distinct honor of having President Eileen Wilson-Oyelaran with us from Kalamazoo College. Eileen is a graduate from 1977. Her advisor was Dolores Cross. Eileen and I were talking earlier about the unique period. Every period is a unique period. You guys are in a unique period. Remember that. You will be when we look back on this. But the unique period in which Eileen was with us, and it's an honor to have you tonight, Eileen. Thank you. This is the tail end of quite a whirlwind lecture series within the school. We still have one or two more. I think tonight will be the apex of a very prodigious lecture series with a group of the most distinguished scholars nationally and internationally on education and higher education. Eileen will certainly, I think, bring this to crystallization for us tonight. Just to recap, we've had the Bowen Lecture with Michael Olivas from the University of Houston. We had Sarah Goldrick-Rabb come talk with us about access. Sarah was from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have had, boy, who did we have? Oh, we had, who could forget Sean Harper, right? Had Sean Harper come and talk with us. Sean is a distinguished scholar and scholar in residence with us this semester. Sean is with us from the University of Pennsylvania. And Sean will be back in a couple weeks to do some work on discussions about race at the Claremont colleges across the 5 Cs. He'll be back on the 18th for that. We'll look forward to that. And tonight we have Eileen, and Eileen made me promise that I would not read verbatim from her bio, and I certainly wouldn't do that. But I do need to give Eileen a proper introduction, and Eileen is the 17th president at Kalamazoo College, and she formerly served as vice president and dean of the college at Salem College in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Her background, her educational background, her expertise is in early childhood development, in multicultural education, and she's written extensively in these areas. She has worked internationally. She worked in Nigeria. She's worked with UNICEF. She has made many important contributions abroad and domestically. She is currently the chair of the President's Council of the AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, and the immediate past chair of another acronym we like to throw around in higher education, NICU, which is the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. And she's a product of Southern California. Grew up in Southern California and attended Pomona College, graduated at Pomona College, on the board board of trustees at Pomona College, and also on boards of a number of other very notable and important organizations in the Michigan area that are associated with Kalamazoo College. She has a BA in sociology from Pomona and MA PhDs in education, we're very proud to say, from Claremont Graduate School, now university, and we're going to get to the bottom of why gowns change shortly, but more on that later, okay? Without further ado, let me introduce it's an honor to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, the 18th Sally Loyd Casanova Lecturer, Eileen Wilson-Oyelaran. Eileen, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. You know, I come from a call and response culture, so we're going to try that over again. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. That's a little better. Now I know that you are awake. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I understand that you have been visited today by an accrediting agency. I have had lots of experiences with accrediting agencies, and I suspect that many of you would like to be at home with your feet up and with your favorite beverage. So I thank you very much for coming to be with me for a little while this evening. The other thing I need to say is that I'm absolutely honored and humbled to have been invited to be a Sally Loyd Casanova lecturer. Claremont Graduate School has made incredible contributions to the field of education. And so to be included among individuals who have been invited to give this lecture is a real honor, and I'm very humbled to be here. When I got this invitation, of course, the first thing that came to mind was, my God, what am I supposed to say? Particularly when Scott talked about the fact that this lecture is often given by a researcher, and I don't define myself as a researcher. I do define myself as a higher ed leader. But the second thing I began to think about was my own relationship to Claremont Graduate University. And it led me to think about 3 words: change, resolution, and karma. So I'll talk a little bit first about change and resolution. Dean Thomas alluded to this, but during my time at Claremont Graduate School, it was the school then, the institution was not without opportunities for improvement, particularly in the area of diversity and inclusion. And there was a small group of individuals who tried to bring to the attention of the institution what appeared to be lacking. We tried to do this in the classroom, and we tried to do this outside of the classroom. Often, our perspectives, the distillation of our personal experiences, the research questions that were of importance to us were deemed of limited value by fellow students, but I think more disappointing, they were deemed of limited value by faculty members, the individuals who were supposed to be our mentors. So it was really quite gratifying for me after I got the invitation and I began to look at the website and look at the changes in the faculty, the increased diversity in the faculty, the breadth of scholarship that is currently being undertaken. These felt to me like welcome changes and a possibility for some personal resolution on my part. So I'm glad to be here at this time, at this moment. And I thank the people who are responsible for the leadership that's brought about this change. Now let me say something about karma, which is a personal confession. Most of my formal education, at least collegiate formal education, took place right here in Claremont. Pomona in the late 60s, and then Claremont Graduate University in the mid-70s. And as you know, that was a time of foment on many campuses. For many people, Claremont seemed sleepy and idyllic, but for some of us, it was the seat of activism. And it wouldn't be an understatement to say that I had minor involvement in that activism. So it's ironic, or perhaps it's karma, that now, every day as president of Kalamazoo College, I have the privilege of sitting and negotiating with faculty and students about a variety of contentious issues, issues that we hope we can resolve in constructive ways that make us proud and that sustain the institution. And so we discuss things like whether we should divest from fossil fuels and how we respond to academic boycotts. So I can tell you, if any of you are in doubt, that what goes around does come around. But I can also tell you that I've learned something very powerful, that there's a karmic lesson, so to speak. And that's that when individuals who've had a history of making change outside of institutions bring their values and their perspectives to try to begin to make change from inside the institution, the possibility for real transformational work in the academy becomes exponential. So that's change, karma, and resolution. Now this evening, I'd like to reflect on higher education in three ways. I'd like to talk a little bit about my assessment of the current landscape in which the higher ed enterprise operates. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think that means for our students, and finally to talk about the implications of that for leadership. And I want to begin by trying to identify this landscape in which college presidents find themselves making decisions on a daily basis. When I talk with presidents, particularly long-serving presidents of independent colleges and universities, many of them will say that it's not change itself that is a source of discomfort for them. They will remind you that change has always been a part of the higher education landscape. But what they find particularly challenging is the exponential rate of that change, and the fact that it's very difficult at some times to figure out which vectors or which intersection of vectors are going to have the greatest impact on higher ed and on their particular institutions. It seems to me that there are four important aspects of that landscape at this time: politics and policy, demographic change, communication and cultural shifts, and the ongoing technological revolution. And I'll say a little bit about each of these. First, policy and politics. One of the things that all presidents are trying to get their hands around right now is the increased role that the federal government is assuming with respect to higher education. I think there are four factors that are driving this. First of all, the federal government is investing more money in higher education than it's ever done before. Secondly, it's clear that if this nation is going to continue to be competitive, we have to increase the number of college graduates, and we must ensure that a post-secondary education is available to people who come from humble backgrounds. There are two political issues as well that I think are important factors at this time. The absolute inability of the executive and the legislative branch to come together collaboratively to develop an agenda for higher ed, and the desire of the legislative and the executive branch to be seen to be responsive to the fears and the concerns of parents and students regarding the cost and the value of higher education. Now, as state support for higher education has diminished, the federal government has increased its investment in the sector, primarily through the provision of student aid programs. Currently, the federal government spends $150 billion each year on federal student loan and grant programs. In contrast, all the states collectively invest approximately $70 billion in support of public colleges and universities and in providing student aid to students within the state who attend private colleges. So the federal government is now spending more than twice what all of the states are spending on higher education. So it's not surprising that he who gives the money wants to dictate what's happening. So let me give one example of how this plays out in our sector. The federal government obviously wants to be responsible stewards of tax dollars. And so Congress and the Department of Education are eager to ensure that the investment in student aid is producing good results and that the funds are being used wisely. Now, there's something that is often missing in this conversation when we talk about return on investment in terms of student aid. And that's namely that each year the federal government makes $40 billion on the student aid program. That comes from the interest rates and other aspects of the program. Only about a fourth of those proceeds are reinvested into the Pell Grant program, which serves our neediest students. The remainder of those funds, about $30 billion, goes for deficit reduction. So when we're having this conversation about student aid and stewardship, we've got to remember that a whole lot of money is being generated on that program. So in an effort to ensure that federal dollars are well spent, and in an effort to be sensitive to a Congress that is very concerned about spending, President Obama has proposed a series of policies that will link student aid to performance outcomes, both outcomes of students and outcomes of the institution. And he is proposing to do this by something you may have heard of, a new college rating system that's being called the scorecard. The administration actually expects this scorecard to be ready by the 15-16 academic year. And in fact, presidents are all waiting because the first draft of the scorecard should be issued any day from now. Now, what the government hopes to do is to publish this rating system so that parents will have an idea of which schools are doing a good job educating which students. But more than that, by fiscal year 2018, the federal government proposes to tie the rating system to the award of student aid. Students who go to colleges that are highly rated would receive larger Pell Grants and more affordable student loans. We don't know exactly what that means, but there'll probably be a variation in the interest rates. The complicated thing is that there is a real consensus in the higher education community that we should be focused on improving outcomes. and that we should be meeting as best we can the needs of students who may not have been as well prepared or students who have limited economic capacity. However, there is great angst in the higher education community about this particular proposal. Many questions have been raised about the metrics. What will the metrics be? How will those metrics be counted? Questions have been raised about student privacy. Questions have been raised about how institutions will be rated and about which institutions and perhaps which students will be harmed by this initiative. If you're a place-bound student, it doesn't matter how well an institution is rated or how high an institution is rated. You have to go where you have the opportunity to attend. So this scorecard presents a perfect example of increased federal oversight into higher education. Now, any of you who have been listening to any news are well aware that the legislative branch and the executive branch are not working very effectively together. But in spite of this, the executive branch has made a commitment to improve post-secondary outcomes for all students, particularly low-income, immigrant, and first-generation college students. So what do you do if you're the president and the secretary of education and you can't get anything through the Congress and you want to make something happen? Well, you decide that higher education can be regulated through executive authority. And that's exactly what the president and the secretary have done. So what does this mean? It means that on any day, I can have one, none, or 3 emails that come from the Secretary of Education or the White House and begin, "Dear colleague." We never know what the next new idea is going to be. And within the last several years, the executive branch has asked colleges and universities to respond to Title IX reform, new sexual assault guidelines, net price calculators, financial responsibility standards, and now the new scorecard. While we're doing so, we have also been asked to make new pledges and new commitments around issues of student access and success. Many of these policy initiatives are very meritorious. The issue from the presidential perspective is that they are coming fast and furiously, seemingly out of nowhere, and often with little input from those who are going to be affected by the decision. When you talk with presidents, they quietly confess that it is hard to anticipate what is coming next. It's very difficult to respond thoughtfully and purposively because the time frames are almost like, let us know what you think day after tomorrow. More importantly, there appears to be no way to say, Mr. Secretary, let's proceed cautiously. This may not be a good idea. There's no way to do that and to be deemed a respectful and thoughtful critic. More concerning, I think, overall in this whole issue of politics and policy is that it appears that higher education policy is being generated on the basis of political exigency rather than on evidence-based theory. This increased oversight has brought a new dimension to the higher education landscape. Now, demographic shifts are also having a significant impact on higher education. The number of high school graduates is decreasing at the same time that it is becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. In recent years, the capacity and the willingness of middle-class families to pay for college have diminished. So consider the following. Between 2014 and 2019, the number of high school graduates is expected to decrease in all regions of the country except the South. Currently, adult students over 25 represent the fastest growing cohort in college. According to the National Student Clearinghouse, during fall 2013, 39% of all post-secondary students, undergraduates, were over 25 years of age. By 2021, adults over 25 will constitute 43% of all post-secondary enrollments. According to the Lawler Group, a higher education and marketing research firm, undergraduate enrollment rate at private institutions is slated to slow dramatically. During the past 8 years, enrollment at private colleges and universities increased by 38%. For the next 8 years, the projection is that the growth rate will be only 10%. Demographic projections indicate that by 2027, the country will witness a significant drop in the number of white high school graduates and an increase in the number of Asian and Latino graduates, while African American graduation rates will remain flat. In recent years, many American families have found it increasingly difficult to pay for higher education. According to the U.S. Census data, in 2012, the median household income in this country was $50,054. The pocket cost for attending a private institution the same year was $18,100, roughly 36% of the median family income. There's a disconnect there. Among families that are perceived to have the ability to pay, increasing numbers indicate an unwillingness to do so. According to the Princeton Review in 2012, 79% of college applicants said the economy either affected their decision about where to apply, so they just didn't apply to certain institutions, and it definitely affected the decision in terms of which school they elected to attend. This mix of demographic factors suggests that colleges and universities of all types must be prepared to serve an increasingly diverse student body. It also means that parents and students are going to become increasingly price sensitive, and for all but the most elite institutions, financial aid, both merit aid and need-based aid, will become an increasingly important factor in their enrollment decisions. Institutions that focus primarily on traditional age students can anticipate increased competition for those students. So if demography is destiny, the terrain for higher education is a little bit rocky. Let me turn to shifts in culture and communication. At this time, higher education is operating in an environment in which its value, its contributions to the success of a democratic society, its value to the economy, all of these are in contention. For most of the populace, an undergraduate education is viewed as a private investment. The role that higher education plays in contributing to the public good appears to be largely invisible. Moreover, higher education finds itself responding to media stories that feed fear and misinform. The recent coverage of the lack of employment opportunities for liberal arts graduates and stories about student debt provide excellent examples of the way we are being treated in the media. The value of a liberal arts education is now under great scrutiny by members of the media, the very people who had these liberal arts educations. In an economic environment that is characterized by limited job creation, the media seem comfortable suggesting that studying the humanities or the fine arts renders one unemployable. The evidence for these arguments is often based on employment immediately after graduation. A recent study completed by the AAC&U and the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems reports that liberal arts majors experience a great deal of professional success, and that over their lifetimes, many may earn more than their peers who pursued pre-professional degrees. What's most disturbing about the treatment of this issue is that it's all focused on income. There is no consideration of what the humanities contribute to the exercise of foreign affairs, to the understanding of the human condition in this country and beyond, and what it means and how it contributes to a life well lived. These are never part of the media conversation. In a similar fashion, the discussion of student debt has focused on the extremely small number of students who graduate with debt over $100,000. Any of you want to guess what the percentage is?
25?
Anybody else? This man guessed. Come on, the rest of you can't guess. 4%. So all the media coverage we've had about student debt and student aid, 4% of all graduate and undergraduate students have student debt over $100,000. The average debt load per borrower among all bachelor's degree recipients in 11-12 was $29,900 at private colleges and $25,000 at public universities. That is roughly the cost of a Ford Focus. And I like to say a Ford Focus depreciates as soon as you drive it off the lot, and if you're lucky, your education appreciates every year. But that's not part of the media conversation. There is no question that student debt is a real concern to families. Addressing this issue and other questions related to the value of higher education require careful consideration based on sound data. Current media treatment is not providing such information and is instead contributing to public angst and fostering skepticism around American higher education. And then the last issue in the room, technology. The rapid and continually unfolding revolution in information technology and communications is probably the most significant landscape shifter in higher education right now. While higher education has been called to address technological innovation throughout its history, I do believe that the current revolution in technology and communication may be much more significant than previous ones. In his book, Teaching Naked, Jose Antonio Bowen writes, and I quote, "The future of higher education is deeply entwined with new technologies. Technology has changed students and professors, how we access knowledge, the nature of community, the habits of learning, our understanding of patience, and virtually everything else about education. The internet has challenged traditional universities with completely new and global sources of competition, and they cannot be regulated away." Duke professor Kathy Davidson argues that public access to the internet creates an environment in which anyone in the world who has access to technology can share ideas with anybody else. They could be good ideas, bad ideas, but they can share ideas. This opportunity gives rise to what she calls distributive education, the capacity for global collaborative information producing and sharing in which the expert, also known as the faculty member, is decentered. According to Davidson, MOOCs leverage online technology, but they are not pedagogically innovative. According to her, MOOCs continue the long-standing process of having the expert speak to whomever is in the audience. It's just happening online, and they're reaching more people. She predicts a higher education future that will include less focus on the faculty expert and more peer-to-peer learning. She envisions an increase in what she calls DOCs, distributive online collaborative courses, in which knowledge will be jointly produced and more produced by peers. Now, I want to confess that I make no claim to be an expert in technology. I'm a novice who is trying to learn. However, I recognize that higher education, and I think particularly residential liberal arts colleges, will need to grapple with the implications of our digital reality. And I'd welcome your thoughts on this. It becomes forcefully apparent to me how important this is when I think of my 4-year-old grandson, who is completely facile on the iPad. Or when I think about the fact that in 2010, the most requested Christmas gift among 6-year-olds was the request for an iPad. Those children are now 10. They will be in our classrooms in 7 years. And given how quickly change takes place in higher education, we better start thinking about this now if we want to be ready for them 7 years from now. It is also estimated that by 2020, K-12 education will use no textbooks. Everything will be given to students online. So what does this mean in terms of how the students who will be in our classrooms sooner than we realize, how they will approach learning, and more importantly, the question that arises for me is how should it impact our approach to pedagogy? Assessments of the impact of technological innovation on higher education run from Christensen and Horm's doomsday prophecies directed at traditional higher ed, particularly residential colleges, to more optimistic perspectives that envision opportunities for an exciting redesign, one that makes traditional higher education more inclusive, more equitable, and more engaging. This latter perspective is represented best by Davidson and by EDUCAUSE CEO Diana Oblinger. Others, like the former president of Princeton, Bill Bowen, argue, as does Christensen, that the new technologies may enable higher education to address what he calls the cost disease. However, Bowen cautions that we have no evidence at this point that this is actually possible. I do think that the MOOCs won the communication battle. They had an excellent marketing campaign, and that campaign captured the imagination of many. However, their efficacy as a vehicle for quality teaching and learning and for cost containment has yet to be demonstrated. And the notion that MOOCs are a panacea to address the needs of students with limited preparation, I think, has been clearly debunked at this time. I do think there is one really intriguing opportunity, though. The big data about learning that is being collected through MOOCs, I think, will give us, over time, some very interesting information about teaching and learning. As the leader of a small liberal arts college that was founded in 1833 and expects to be here for at least another 175 years, I find Christensen's discussion of disruptive innovation a cautionary tale, but not a prophecy. Although essentially conservative, liberal arts colleges also have the capacity to be resilient. The new innovations in technology and media provide a wonderful opportunity for our institutions to embrace alternative pedagogies that may allow for increased personalization, unprecedented levels of global engagement, and new approaches to the creation and the dissemination of content. The task before us, I believe, is to take these innovations seriously and to think both creatively and divergently about what they mean for the education we provide and to ponder the ways in which they might be liberating for both students and faculty. Much like the physical geography of Southern California, the landscape of higher education is marked by jagged mountains of public scrutiny and sensational media coverage and sharp fault lines of demographic shifts, technological innovation, and federal intervention. And so higher education leaders deal with this rapid and complex changing landscape each day. But most importantly, each year, they welcome to their campus a cohort of students who have concerns and needs, many of which are absolutely unrelated to this landscape. And here I'm talking particularly about the kinds of students I deal with each day, students who enroll in post-secondary education right after high school. Many of these students are digital natives. And while they are proficient with the emerging technologies, many may have become socially limited by their heavy reliance on media communication. These students are comfortable leveraging learning from all sources, including everything that's in the clouds. And if we are honest, at least if I'm honest, I have to concede that their knowledge of the new technologies surpasses me. They've developed innovative ways for learning, for creating community, and for organizing for action online. They've become habituated to an environment in which they are constantly bombarded by the media. And as a result, many have had limited time for critical reflection and for face-to-face interaction. The thing that astounds me most is when my 4 adult children are home sitting in one room and they are emailing each other or texting each other in the room. Now, maybe my family's weird, but I see a couple of heads nodding. So, what does this mean about face-to-face communication? And what does this mean about critical reflection? Media scholar Michael Wesch argues that in this digital age, colleges and universities must turn their focus away from helping students become knowledgeable. And he defines knowledgeable as mastery of content and critical thinking skills. And that we must turn our attention to helping students become knowledge-able, which he defines as the ability to find, sort, analyze, criticize, and create new knowledge, often in collaborative contexts that may be both international and intercultural. Davidson argues that within the context of our diverse global community, such knowledge-ability can only be achieved if we cultivate in our students the capacity for immense courtesy, generous listening, and respectful free speech. Unlike those of us who had the luxury of pursuing an undergraduate education during the time when the economy was less fragile, many students today are quite focused on preparing for careers, on finding employment, on paying for college, and on managing their debt. But that is not all that motivates them. These young men and women are also concerned with what Sharon Delos Parks refers to as the big questions. How will they live lives of meaning? How will they respond to the demands of an ever-evolving digital reality? How can they have a positive and significant impact on a world that is beleaguered by violence, by intolerance, by political polarization, and by climate change? How can they help create a world that is more inclusive and more just? Students come to our campuses with deep concerns for these questions. And if institutions are doing their jobs, if institutions are living up to their missions, we will help our students to grapple creatively and collaboratively with the challenges we can identify currently, but more important, with the challenges that we cannot yet foresee. We will prepare our students to become, in the words of Wellesley College President Emerita Diana Chapman Walsh, quote, active participants in the world, potent advocates for human rights, confident leaders willing to take risks in the pursuit of intellectual honesty, of freedom to disagree, of justice and fairness, global citizenship, and mutual responsibility, unquote. At Kalamazoo College, through our unique curriculum that we call the K-Plan, we have created an opportunity that we hope enables our students to exercise leadership in an increasingly connected and interdependent world. Our goal is to ensure that our graduates are at home in the world. And by that, we mean that wherever they find themselves, they can be at home, and wherever they find themselves, they can make a home because they respect difference, because they can view the world from multiple perspectives, because they can adapt to new situations, and because they have the ability to put themselves at the margins. Embedded in this concept of at-homeness is the ability to cross boundaries, real boundaries of language and nationality and culture and geographic region, and personal boundaries of faith tradition and sexual orientation and mental health and physical ability. Those who are at home in the world make connections. They make connections between theory and practice, between the classroom and the real world, between policies and people's lived experience, and they forge authentic personal relationships across difference. Lena Ashton and her colleagues argue that what the world needs from these young people is the capacity for transformational leadership. Moreover, Aston and company observe that to achieve the outcomes described by Walsh and envisioned by those of us at Kalamazoo College, our institutions must attend to the spiritual or the transcendent dimension of our students' lives by moving beyond a primary focus on technical knowledge and cognitive skills to a more expansive consideration of issues related to self-awareness, equanimity, empathy, and concern for others. This call for a greater focus on the inner lives of our students is echoed by Parker, Zion, and Scribner in their volume, The Heart of Higher Education. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to be part of an intergenerational mentoring group. Kind of scary when they tell you you're the elder. But in this group of young faculty, I found the same sense of feeling fractured that our students identify. We're finding no ways for our faculty to deal with that sense of being fractured, and we surely are not modeling it for our students. And so I would argue that at a time when discussions of educational quality increasingly focus on test performance and scorecards and gainful employment and earnings, it is up to higher education leaders to ensure that we do not lose sight of our responsibility to assist our students in their quest to determine how to live lives of meaning and how to have an impact in this interconnected, digital, highly fractured global community. I believe that small liberal arts colleges are uniquely positioned but not exclusively positioned to address these challenges. When our institutions provide carefully designed, developmentally sequenced educational experiences that take place in the classroom, in the local community, and abroad, when these experiences are accompanied with opportunities for structured reflection and self-assessment, our students have an opportunity to grapple with the big questions. And when such grappling occurs in environments that are diverse and inclusive, with all the messiness that involves, our students have an opportunity to practice building the kinds of communities we hope they will make manifest in the world. So what does that mean for leadership? If we are to equip our students to be transformational leaders who are at home in the world, they must see that type of leadership in action on our campuses. Believe me, this is much easier said than done. In the mid-70s, when I was a student if you had come up to me and said, Eileen, I know what you're going to do. You're going to leverage your education in service of justice, I would have said, you're absolutely right. You got me. But if you had told me that in attempting to do so, I would be concerned with market competition, endowment performance, strategy, and cost containment, I would have said, not me, no way. And yet, many higher education leaders face exactly that dilemma each day. We are called to, and we are desirous of remaining firmly grounded in what Walsh calls higher education's highest calling, while we simultaneously navigate a highly competitive, rapidly changing landscape. From my perspective, this requires leaders who operate, in the words of Parker Palmer, with their heads descended into their hearts. And yet, even when our heads rest comfortably in our hearts, difficult decisions must be made, decisions that may cause angst and even personal discomfort. The complexity of the higher education landscape, coupled with the imperative that we model the leadership we hope our students will exercise in the future, to me suggests that we need new forms of leadership. Leadership that is team-based rather than hierarchical. Leadership in which the role of the CEO is posing pertinent questions, not having all the answers. Leadership that recognizes that the best ideas can emerge from anywhere in the organization. And as a result of this awareness, leadership that builds structures and opportunities for such ideas to emerge. Leadership that challenges and engages all constituents to rethink shared governance. Leadership that works to disrupt the siloed hierarchies of decision-making and the separate spheres of operation that so characterize our campuses. Leadership that is characterized by significant transparency and information sharing among all constituents. Leaderships that sees the inevitable conflicts that arise as we attempt to build communities that are diverse and inclusive as a source for learning, as an opportunity for difficult conversations. Leadership that embraces conflicts embedded in the intersection between the mission and the values we hold dear and the existential institutional imperatives we face on a daily basis. Leadership that creates a space in which conflicts can be truthfully acknowledged and, ideally, thoughtfully resolved. Leadership that is continuously reflective at the personal and at the institutional level, using successes and failures, and believe me, there will be failures, as a source for improvement. Without a doubt, leading like this in a complex landscape requires the capacity to adapt, and it requires a great deal of courage. Anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson has observed that composing one's life is a bit like improvising. It's a bit like playing jazz. I think the same can be said for leading in higher education today. In jazz, there is no developed score. Similarly, as I've tried to suggest, the higher education landscape is also constantly shifting. The leader and her team, much like a jazz combo, may have a sense of rhythm and flow, but whether the music sizzles or the institution survives and thrives depends on how well the musicians and the team function individually and as a collective. And of course, there are risks when you improvise. Sometimes it can go really well, and sometimes it doesn't go very well at all. As higher education leaders navigate the gap between what we value and what we must deal with each day, we are required to lead with a humility that enables us both to learn and to be changed. In this rapidly changing higher education landscape, it is courage and the willingness to learn and be changed that higher education leaders must cultivate and sustain, ever mindful, as Bateson cautions, that the willingness to learn and to be changed is fragile, and it is vulnerable to fatigue and to fear. In spite of these vulnerabilities, we are called, in the words of Parker Palmer, to stand in the gap between the way things are and the way they might be, faithfully holding the tension and negotiating between what is and what is possible. We must do this while every moment we are modeling for our students the leadership we hope they will exercise in the world. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions, but I do want to let those who have been here so patiently and have been working all day, if anyone wants to run, please feel free to do so. Yes.
You're great. And the question has to do with the technical and the professional over against the liberal arts and the humanistic. And to present that to the students and make them participate in facing that with us. We say as faculty or whatever we are as educators, face that and try to deal with it. And you don't really have an answer to that, but you want to involve the student in it as well. I think of caricatures of two different faculty members. One a humanist professionally in the English department, treating in a very critical and technical way, but somewhat distant from the feeling human values perspective, and somebody who teaches welding and auto mechanics, who is a true humanist and to my mind a liberal educator. And I'm faced with that, and I could see that on our own faculty. And I think the students pick it up.
Oh, they do.
They know when something's missing, and they know what to look for. And to have them in each discipline, in any discipline, with the faculty who are best at it and everybody else trying, to face that with us, and become learner teachers, back to us and to one another. not just having it handed down by somebody who's an expert. And nobody's an expert in all aspects of what they're doing, I would think.
Well, I think there's a wonderful opportunity for the paradigm to be shifted. And if we recognize what it is that the students bring in terms of those competencies and open it up and let them experiment, I think we'll see amazing things. But part of that is our own fear as experts of letting go, or of recognizing that learning may be manifest in a different way than the way we're used to having it manifest as written papers or what have you, that a whole new set of opportunities are going to be created. Yes?
I just wanted to first thank you very much for what I thought was an absolutely invigorating speech. So my question for you, you mentioned that you feel that the MOOCs won the communication battle in higher education at this point, and I would definitely agree with you. I'm currently the director of institutional research at Pittsburgh College, so I'm very intimately aware of these new federal standards that are coming down the college scorecard and all of this real pressure from not necessarily higher education, but from above higher education and all around it to really show the value of an education. And so I guess my question for you is, as a leader and as, speaking to people who will become future leaders within education, how do we reclaim that battle of, away from what the MOOCs have done and really talking about, how do the liberal arts colleges and even the bigger public universities, how do they assert themselves in a way that defends what we do in higher education and hopefully gets people moving away from this completely economic understanding of what education is? Because there is that aspect. I think that's an aspect we can't ignore. But how do we go back to the understanding of, the highest goal of education? How do we get people to understand that this is still valuable?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, if I had all the answers, Kalamazoo College would be in a different place. I do think, however, that what I said was the MOOCs won the marketing battle. We have to do a better job of marketing ourselves. I think higher ed could be much more proactive. In each of the story examples that I gave, we have been reactive. We are reacting now to the articles about student debt. We are reacting with new research on what's happening with liberal arts graduates. So I think we need to become much more sophisticated and anticipatory in terms of thinking about what is the story we need to tell and what are the multiple ways in which we tell it. We do a lot of talking to each other. And then when other people don't get it, we're surprised. We talk to ourselves. So how do we figure out, what's his name? I want to say Michael Eric Tyson, but no, DeGraff Tyson, the astronomer, the astrophysicist who does the NOVA program, just wrote a very interesting piece on challenging humanists and saying, we're all talking to one another. You're all talking to one another. I have figured out how to make science accessible to the everyday person. And he didn't say this, I'm saying this. He's a rock star. Why don't we have humanist rock stars? Part of it is because we think about our work in ways that only reinforce it for us. And I get that. But if we're going to deal with the kinds of issues that you've raised, we've got to find another way of being in the world and telling our story. Yes?
I appreciated very much your comments about the media and its tendency to emphasize certain kinds of controversies. But there's an inference that I drew from your critique, and that is that higher education itself, especially the national associations, American Council on Education and the rest of the fraternity at 1 DuPont Circle, has not taken up the challenge that you have just articulated in response to the last question of putting forward a much more positive assertion about what higher education accomplishes. So, yes, higher education may have not risen to the occasion appropriately, but how much of that do you assign to the well-known higher education organizations, associations?
I know they're responding now, but again, it's reactive. So CIC, the Council of Independent Colleges, I believe Phi Beta Kappa, and I believe the Association of Learned Societies are all now, they've kind of chopped up this liberal arts thing and everybody's taking a piece of it. From a proactive position, perhaps they could have done more. One of the problems is they fight with one another. So that when you would hope that they would cooperate on something, they have their own internal politics. The other challenge, I think, though, is they would sound like they're justifying their existence, which in some way is true of us as well. It was very interesting. We tried to do some work getting our alumni to be able to get things put in the newspaper, and it was very difficult to get any traction. So, you know, what sells? $100,000 worth of student debt sells.
First and foremost, thank you for your incredibly insightful remarks. Really appreciate it. As a newcomer to higher ed, I've spent most of my career in K through 12. I struggle to not see a very common trajectory in terms of the over-reliance on standardization, state regulations, and it hasn't worked all that well in K through 12. And it's become, and I referenced the charter movement and the charter world, in many ways it's become an arms race, right? With those districts and even those families who have a bit more, can provide a bit more, which creates even increased stratification. So my question to you is, how is this not significantly different to what K through 12 has done, and how does higher ed intend to address that?
I want to make sure I have your question right. If your question is suggesting that what has been inflicted on K-12 is about to be inflicted on higher ed, I would say absolutely. And I had an opportunity to meet with the Secretary of Education about the scorecard, and of course everybody was being polite, so nobody wanted to say, Mr. Secretary, it didn't work for K-12, why are we kicking it up the ladder? But when various presidents tried to talk about how this might be played out on their campuses, there was a real unwillingness to hear alternative views. And I think that's what is particularly distressing about what's happening in this politics versus policy question right now. So if that's your question, the answer is absolutely yes, that is what we see. Our ability to counter it is going to be questionable. The one thing, and I really hate to say this, but my last couple of years at NICU has been quite a political lesson, is this is one time when I am sure the conflict between the Congress and the executive branch will prevent much from happening. But here's a scenario. Take a historically black institution on one hand. Admit students that other people won't admit. Take an institution that I know in the heart of inner city Detroit, a Catholic women's institution that has been working with the urban poor for years. Those students don't graduate in 4 years. Some of them will never graduate, but you know, 3 years worth of education is better than no higher education. Those are the schools that are going to be penalized by this scorecard. Kalamazoo's going to be fine. And when we tried to raise that issue, it simply was not heard. I was in a meeting of 200 people with the Undersecretary of Education, and someone raised the question, how many of you agree with the president's agenda to promote access, to increase outcomes? Every hand went up. The next question was, how many of you feel like the scorecard is the vehicle to do it? Not one hand went up. So we're in this, at least for me personally, a very challenging situation where we accept the goals, but we're not having a good conversation about how to get there. We're not asking, what can we learn from K-12? That would be an interesting question that would caution moving this same paradigm forward. That conversation is not happening.
Thank you very much for such thought-provoking remarks. I was particularly struck by your observation about the increasing role of the federal government in creating policy and regulating higher education. And so, part of what occurred to me as I heard your remarks was, we have, a former superintendent of, public schools creating pretty extensive policies on higher education. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on the capacity of the policymakers in the Department of Education to develop and implement appropriate policies in higher education. Is the capacity there for people who understand intimately the system of higher education much better than the Secretary of Education who comes from the K-12 background? And the other part that sort of occurred to me was what your thoughts were about First Lady Michelle Obama taking up higher education as being sort of the cause that she's going to champion, and particularly first generation college student access. Do you see that as potentially being an avenue, particularly in terms of the PR piece of it, in helping us leverage a conversation that will get us away from sort of econometric analyses of the benefits of higher education?
Thank you for your question. Let me take the last part first, and I'm just going to tell you a story. I'm going to invent the dates because I don't have the actual dates in my mind. So I open up my email, dear colleague. You're invited to an event at the White House. Mrs. Obama is about to launch this access program for low-income and first-generation college students. We want your institution to come up with a list of things you're going to do. Now, I'm at an institution that in the past 9 years has gone from 9% Pell to 21% Pell. I don't have another dime. We don't get credit for anything we have done because what they wanted was something new. So this is when the politics versus the policy. It's not like the people who were doing the best work were invited to the White House. You know who was invited? The top 60 liberal arts colleges and the Ivies. And don't you know the HBCUs got furious? Now I'm telling you the dirt now. This is the dirt of what happened in that whole scenario. Literally, there was a week that the institutions had got the Dear Colleague letter, had to respond back. The conference was supposed to have been, I think it was November, and it was postponed because of Mandela's death. But this thing happened just like this. I love the idea. What would have happened if we had really gotten in the room the people who have real stories of success to tell? What if my colleague from Marygrove College in Detroit could have talked about what they were doing? So, because he doesn't have Kalamazoo's wealth and I don't have Pomona's wealth. So to assume that everybody is going to do the same thing in the same way, or that the students we get are similar. So unfortunately for me, it felt more, what could have been an opportunity felt more like PR. Your question about the capacity in the Department of Ed, I believe there is capacity there. I just believe that politics trumps policy. There is something else going on that I did not talk about in my comments because I haven't quite figured it out in my mind. But there is a new, I call it the philanthropy policy complex, okay? We've got a lot of people in philanthropy who have their ideas about what should happen, and they move back and forth from the foundations to the federal government agencies, and they are making campaign contributions. And I'm concerned that policies are being generated not necessarily on good evidence in some cases, but that philanthropic piece is another piece. So it's politics, policy, and philanthropy all mixed up in a very strange way. And I haven't quite thought out the last part. That's why I didn't talk about it, but it's there.
Thank you, Eileen, for giving us so much to think about. I'm very concerned about student debt, since student debt now outpaces credit card debt in our country. And it just seems like an enormous burden on students. So I wonder, and not to mention the impact on future alumni giving when they have to pay off the college education that they already received. Do you have any ideas on how we support students to plan to bear this burden so that, so that we can reduce student debt? Obviously, the best way to reduce it is to give out less and get more financial aid in the form of grants, but it doesn't look like that's the way it's going, or that's the way it's been going. So any ideas on how better to prepare them to meet this real burden that's upon them?
You know, I think there are two different issues. One of the things we know is that families that could afford to pay for college aren't saving for college. And so one of the things we really have to do is try to get the savings up among those who can or could afford to pay. We obviously know that a lot of the growth that we're going to have is going to come from families for whom paying for college is going to be very difficult, which is one of the reasons, as you know, that college presidents do a lot of begging to try to get the scholarships that enable us to provide opportunities for those students. Whether we can forge opportunities for work and school in new and different ways would be something to think about. Whether the idea of 4 years of college, you know, together as opposed to more spaced out so there's some work in between becomes another option. I don't see ways that there's going to be significant cost cutting. There could be better efforts to contain the cost at where we are now. But I think it's a very real challenge. Thank you all very much. You've been a fabulous audience.
Eileen, thank you. This is, as I had hoped, the conversation that crystallizes a lot of other discussions and ideas leading up to tonight. And if you could have only seen what happened in this room 4 weeks ago, where we had a free area scholar and an indigenous scholar debating privatization in education, and education is a public good, you'll know that tonight we made it concrete terms what's happening to us. And that means a great deal. Presidents in begging, deans beg or provide opportunities for people to provide support. And tonight's lecture was generously supported by so many of you, faculty, Dean Circle members, those who give substantial amounts to the School of Education and make tonight possible. Students who have turned out tonight after, well, this is a kind of tough, I see you, Alonzo, there. Tough point in the semester and after a day full of WASC. Our staff who has tirelessly put together this long string of lecture series, I want to thank all of you. Now I want to circle back around to philanthropy in education. Jamie Marisota stood at this podium, who is the president of Lumina and a good friend. And he gave some of you may remember his talk, and it was something like, the title was, I'll paraphrase, "It's the Learning Stupid." You said nothing about learning tonight, Eileen, but you said everything about learning tonight, because it's all embedded within that. But the learning idea and the focus on learning does fall in that category of assessment. And I think that that's important. And it was a great observation about the K-12ing of higher education now and the impacts that that's going to have as Jamie tries to reach with Lumina the big goal of having 60% of the population with a meaningful higher education credential by 2025. He's drilled that into me. I can repeat that. And you know, the implications of trying to meet that goal while trying to meet these other goals simultaneously and create a system of accountability are about to be felt full force. The philanthropy part of it, though, the last 6 months, many of you know, I have 2 students working on dissertations dealing with philanthropy in higher education and the philanthropy agenda of mega foundations. The role of philanthropy is an incredibly undemocratic force, a good force in most instances, but an incredibly undemocratic force in higher education and in K-12 education, but we're speaking about higher education today in particular. So I think that that's an area that we certainly need to be paying close attention to going forward. We could go on, I could go on and you could listen to me, but you already know all that. So let me step away one moment. I have a plaque here for the Casanova lecturers. Students, we can get another plaque, but there are 18 names on this plaque, starting with Sister Kathleen Ross, who was our first Casanova lecturer, and ending in 2014 with President Wilson-Oyelaran as our 18th Casanova lecturer. There are 18 blank spaces here for those of you that are going to graduate and come back. And as Eileen said as she stood at the podium, if you had asked me, what I was going to do with this education, you never know. But we look forward to you being here. And Eileen, it is an absolute honor to be able to have your name on this list of our most distinguished graduates that include, well, you're the 4th president of 18 speakers now. We have heads of professional associations. I invite all of you to look at the list. I know I point when you come in the office all the time, but the most distinguished professors in the country are on this list. This list is us, this list is you, and we thank you for lending your good name in your commitment and your ideals to CGU and to tonight's lecture. And thank you very much, Eileen. And thank you all of you for coming out tonight.